The patient clutched her smartphone with such terrifying force that her knuckles had turned completely translucent under the harsh clinical lights of the emergency room. It was 11:47 p.m. when the paramedics wheeled her through the sliding glass doors of Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. She had been pulled from a jarring collision on Interstate 93 just 30 minutes prior. Her right wrist was severely swollen, beginning to blossom into a deep, angry purple, and a crust of dried blood traced the curve of her left eyebrow. Yet, despite the shock and the pain, she had only one frantic, breathless request before they even thought about inserting an IV line. "Please, you have to call my husband. He's the first one in my favorites. Please." Thalia Thorne, a seasoned trauma nurse who had spent the last 8 years navigating the chaotic ebb and flow of the MGH emergency ward, took the phone with practiced, gentle hands. She tapped the screen to wake it up. The lock screen illuminated the dimly lit triage bay, and right there, beneath the time and a barrage of unread notifications, was a photograph. It was a picture of Callahan Vance. Her Callahan, her own husband. He was standing on a sun-drenched porch of a white coastal house, his arms wrapped securely around a little girl with bright, laughing eyes, the ocean stretching out endlessly in the background. If you have ever wondered what you would do if a world-shattering truth was suddenly, violently dropped into your bare hands without a single warning, stay right here. Linger in this story. Would you have hit the call button right then and there, screaming his name into the receiver? Or would you have swallowed the glass shards of your own life and maintained a terrifying, absolute silence just like Thalia did? Because Thalia did not scream. She did not drop the phone. She did not look down at the bleeding, frightened woman on the gurney as an enemy. Instead, she felt a sudden, glacial detachment wash over her. The cacophony of the emergency room, the beeping monitors, the shouting residents, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum seemed to recede instantly, as if someone had sealed her inside a heavy, soundproof glass vault. The patient's chart said her name was Serafina Adler. She was 34 years old, suffering from a minor hairline fracture in her wrist and a mild concussion. But the most prominent thing about her was the sheer terror in her wide, dilated eyes. She did not look like a woman playing the role of a hidden mistress in the shadows. She looked exactly like what she claimed to be, a terrified, devoted wife desperately waiting for her husband to rush through the hospital doors to save her. Thalia's gaze drifted slowly, mechanically, down to Serafina's left hand, which rested on the coarse hospital blanket. And there, waiting for her, was the second devastating blow of the night. A white gold wedding band. It was almost perfectly identical to the one currently resting on Thalia's own left ring finger, right down to the custom, delicate wave pattern engraved on the inside of the band. Callahan had sworn to her, holding her hands in his 4 years ago, that he had designed that specific wave himself. He had promised that a boutique jeweler on Newbury Street had cast it exclusively for them, a symbol of their unique, unrepeatable love. Thalia set Serafina's smartphone down on the stainless steel rolling tray with a quiet metallic click. She turned her head and caught the eye of another triage nurse. "I need you to cover box 4 for exactly 2 minutes, she said, her voice eerily steady. She walked down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the staff break room. She didn't run. She didn't stumble. She simply closed the heavy wooden door behind her, plunging herself into the quiet hum of the vending machines. She pulled her own phone from her scrub pocket and dialed Callahan's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, sweetheart." His deep, soothing voice echoed through the speaker. "Is everything okay?" "I'm here at home, just waiting for you." Thalia stared down at her own trembling hands. Just moments ago, those hands had been hovering over Serafina's screen. Callahan was her husband. In this phone call, he was flawlessly pretending to be lounging in their historic Beacon Hill brownstone. And yet, somewhere tucked deep inside the labyrinth of his lies, there was a little girl whose smiling face Thalia knew she would never, ever be able to scrub from her memory. Thalia did not ask him anything. Her voice did not betray a single tremor when she replied, "Yes, everything is fine. I just wanted to see if you were still awake." Callahan let out a soft, affectionate chuckle, the exact same sound that used to anchor her during her most stressful days. "I'm making you some chamomile tea. You've had a brutal shift tonight, haven't you?" Thalia squeezed her eyes shut for a fractured second. Just 100 feet away, in triage box 4, Serafina Adler was bleeding, scared, and praying for this exact same man to come walking through the MGH sliding doors. In Beacon Hill, according to his flawless script, Callahan was dutifully waiting for Thalia. "You don't have to wait up for me," Thalia said, her tone flat and unreadable. I might be charting late. Go to sleep. She ended the call before he could stretch the deception any further. She stood paralyzed in the center of the break room, staring blankly at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the coffee machine. She noticed a tiny, rust-colored speck of dried blood on the collar of her light blue scrubs. It wasn't hers. She took a coarse paper napkin from the dispenser, dampened it under the sink, and meticulously scrubbed the stain away. She scrubbed until the fabric was damp and clean, as if this tiny, obsessive gesture could somehow claw back the control she had just lost over her entire existence. When Thalia finally pushed the curtain back and re-entered box 4, Serafina immediately snapped her head toward her, wincing at the movement. Did you reach him? Thalia stepped up to the bed and carefully adjusted the heated blanket over the patient's uninjured shoulder, tucking the edges in with professional precision. The front desk administrator is handling the emergency contacts right now. Thalia lied smoothly. Right now, we need to get you up to radiology for a CT scan to check on that head trauma, and we're going to ice that wrist. Serafina nodded, an obedient and trusting patient, but her anxious eyes kept darting back to her phone resting on the tray. Suddenly, the screen lit up with a new notification. It stayed illuminated for only a brief second before fading to black, but Thalia caught every single word of the text preview. Don't say anything to anyone yet. I am going to fix this. Thalia couldn't see the sender's name from her angle, but she felt a cold, hard knot pull tight in the pit of her stomach. That specific phrasing didn't sound like a frantic husband worried about a car wreck. It sounded exactly like a man desperately trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship of lies. For the next hour, Thalia moved with the mechanical, flawless precision she was known for in the trauma ward. She flushed the IV, charted the fluctuating blood pressure, coordinated with the orthopedic resident for the wrist splint, and administered the prescribed painkillers. To anyone watching, Nurse Thorne was a picture of absolute medical competence. No one could possibly guess that beneath her calm exterior, she was mentally tearing down the entire architecture of her marriage, brick by brick, inspecting the rotten foundation of a house she had lived in for 4 years. As the painkillers began to take the edge off Serafina's terror, exhaustion settled into her bones. Her eyelids drooped, and she murmured something into the quiet space of the room that Thalia was entirely unprepared for. He hates hospitals, Serafina whispered, her voice thick with medication. He hates them so much. But for the kids, he always pushes through. He always comes. Thalia's pen froze mid-stroke on the paper chart. The kids. Serafina offered a faint, drowsy smile, the unmistakable, bone-deep tenderness of a mother speaking of her children, even when she was battered and bruised. Dorian and Lyra. Lyra, she gets so terrified if she wakes up in the dark and I'm not there. The pen in Thalia's hand felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Lyra, it was the exact same name Callahan had thoughtfully, lovingly selected for the daughter he claimed they would one day have together, whenever the time was right. At 6:20 a.m., the grueling night shift finally ended. Thalia stripped off her scrubs, changed into her civilian clothes, pulled her heavy wool trench coat tightly around herself, and walked out of the hospital toward the staff parking garage. The Boston skyline was just beginning to catch the pale, icy light of the early morning dawn. Before starting the ignition of her Volvo, she pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and sat in the freezing car. In silence, she opened her browser and typed a single word she had never once wanted to associate with her husband's name: Charleston. Thalia didn't text Callahan on the drive home. She didn't call him. She navigated the morning traffic, crossed the bridge, and parked in her usual spot beneath an old, twisting elm tree on their quiet Beacon Hill street. In the autumn, its leaves always clogged her windshield wipers. She walked up the brick steps of their brownstone slowly, the phone still clutched in her hand, the search results for Charleston, South Carolina, glowing on the screen. When she unlocked the door, the apartment smelled richly of freshly ground French press coffee and toasted sourdough. Callahan was standing at the marble kitchen island, dressed comfortably in gray flannel pajama pants and a fitted navy sweater. He was stirring honey into 2 heavy ceramic mugs, acting as though this morning was just another beautiful, mundane Tuesday in their perfect life. I made you some avocado toast, he said, offering a warm smile without looking up from the mugs. You look completely exhausted. It must have been a nightmare shift. Thalia set her leather tote bag down on one of the bar stools. She didn't move. She just stood there and observed the tableau before her. The artisanal bread, the perfect slices of avocado, the fresh squeezed orange juice, The specific blue mug he knew was her favorite. Everything was arranged with a meticulously crafted domestic piece that, only yesterday, she would have called true love. This morning, looking at it through the lens of the ER, it looked like a highly rehearsed stage production. "There was a bad accident on I-93, Thalia replied, her voice eerily calm. "A young woman. Married. 2 small children." Callahan didn't drop the spoon. He didn't gasp or flinch. But there was a microscopic hesitation, a singular, terrifying beat of silence that lasted just a fraction of a second too long before he responded. "That's awful." Poor woman. That single delayed second burned itself into Thalia's memory like a branding iron. As he fluidly transitioned the conversation to a crucial meeting he supposedly had that afternoon with an elite client in Cambridge, she looked down at his hands. They were the exact same hands that had caught her by the waist 4 years ago when they first met outside a coffee shop near Copley Square. Thalia had just finished a brutal 4-hour shift, and, in her exhaustion, had accidentally spilled hot coffee all over a tube of architectural blueprints Callahan was carrying under his arm. He hadn't been angry. In fact, he had laughed, a rich, booming sound. He had bought her a fresh coffee and told her that even the most brilliantly designed buildings needed a little human error to keep them from feeling sterile. They had sat on a bench for 3 hours that day, talking about the shifting seasons of New England, the brutal demands of hospital shifts, his rising boutique architecture firm, and the way the autumn light hit the brownstones at dusk. He had seemed like a man constructed entirely of quiet, safe details. He remembered everything she said. He asked questions without being intrusive. He had walked her all the way to the tea station under an umbrella that was comically too small for the both of them. A year later, they were married in a historic, rustic inn in the Berkshires. There was no extravagant luxury, just 40 close friends and family members, deep red wine, roasted lamb, wild white hydrangeas, and the solemn promise of an honest, beautiful life. Thalia had believed in that promise with a pure, uncorrupted faith. After the wedding came the lazy Sunday mornings walking through the Boston Public Garden, the overflowing potted plants on their balcony, the impromptu takeout dinners when she was too exhausted to cook, and, much later, the grueling, heartbreaking months of hormone injections, negative tests, and tearful consultations at the fertility clinic. Callahan had always been right there. He would hold her hand so tightly when the doctors delivered yet another round of bad news. He would kiss her forehead and whisper that no medical diagnosis could ever measure how deeply he loved her. Now, standing in the kitchen, he handed her the blue mug. "I'm going to have to fly down to South Carolina this weekend," he said casually, taking a sip of his own coffee. "The Charleston Boutique Hotel project has hit a major zoning snag. I need to be on site." Thalia raised her eyes from the coffee. Charleston. The exact same word that had been the excuse for dozens of absences over the past 3 years. But this time, as Callahan turned his back to place the French press in the sink, Thalia noticed something she had never paid attention to before. Hanging from his leather keychain on the counter was a secondary key. It was small, silver, and had a faded, frayed paper tag attached to it. Barely legible on the tag was the letter S. Thalia didn't ask about the key. Her years in trauma care had taught her a vital lesson. When you discover a wound that looks small on the surface, you never blindly poke at it until you know exactly how deep the internal bleeding goes. She let him finish his coffee. She let him talk animatedly about municipal permits, structural blueprints, and a fake meeting in Charleston that sounded far too polished and rehearsed. She nodded in all the right places, but she was no longer listening as his wife. She was listening as an investigator taking mental notes. When he finally grabbed his coat to leave for his office, he left a receipt from a local bakery on the counter and pressed a quick, customary kiss to her forehead. Before, that simple gesture would have carried her through the darkest hours of her day. Now, the touch of his lips felt like a physical weight, the heavy drag of a monstrous deception brushing against her skin. She waited exactly 10 minutes after the front door clicked shut. Then, she walked into his home office. Callahan's workspace had always been a sanctuary of immaculate order. Pristine 3D architectural models, neatly labeled tubes of blueprints, heavy swatches of natural stone, and a vintage brass desk lamp he had hunted down at an antique market in Maine. Thalia booted up his iMac. Her hands were freezing. She knew his password, a combination of their anniversary and her birth year, because for 4 years, they supposedly hadn't kept a single secret from one another. Or so she had believed. First, she typed Charleston into the main search bar. Dozens of files populated the screen, Old emails from generic clients, flight itineraries, a budget for a lobby renovation. Nothing overtly incriminating. Nothing definitive. It was a perfect smokescreen. She sat back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought about the frayed tag on the silver key. S. She typed Sullivan's. Nothing. Then she typed South Carolina residence. Still nothing. Finally, she thought of the word he used to describe the project. Coastal. She typed in coastal projects. A hidden folder materialized at the very bottom of the directory. Coastal Projects SC. Thalia clicked it open. Inside, there were legitimate-looking blueprints of a boutique hotel facade, mood boards with southern coastal aesthetics, and several spreadsheets with names so mind-numbingly boring, they seemed specifically designed to be ignored. One file was labeled Site, Supervision, Logistics, Cal. Thalia double-clicked it. The spreadsheet wasn't a logistics tracker. It was a meticulously color-coded calendar. Green cells were designated for Boston. Orange cells were marked for Charleston. Gray cells were labeled Transit. Hovering over the orange cells revealed small, hidden notes. Dorian's 5th B-Day. Lyra Pediatrician, 2 p.m., dinner with S. Do not answer phone after 10 p.m. Thalia stopped breathing. Her lungs simply seized. Dorian. Lyra. Lyra wasn't a theoretical baby, discussed in the tragic aftermath of failed IVF treatments. Lyra was a living, breathing little girl with doctor's appointments, bedtimes, and an entire, vibrant life unfolding thousands of miles away from Boston. Her fingers moved over the trackpad with a frantic, desperate energy. She found a subfolder labeled Invoices. Inside were digital receipts for monthly bank transfers. Exactly $1,500 transferred on the 3rd of every single month, always marked with the memo, Project Site Supervision, SC. But the destination routing number didn't belong to a commercial construction firm. It belonged to a joint checking account linked to a residential lease agreement in Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. Thalia opened the PDF of the lease. There was the address. There were the names of 2 minor dependents listed as occupants. And there was the co-signer, Serafina Adler. Thalia shoved the rolling chair back so violently it crashed into a bookshelf. Her body physically demanded distance from the glowing screen. She stumbled out of the office, bracing herself against the hallway wall, and made it to the kitchen. She turned the faucet to cold and shoved her wrists under the freezing water. She didn't cry. There was no room for tears yet. The emotion threatening to rip her apart was something infinitely more terrifying than grief. It was the profound, suffocating realization that she had been living inside a perfectly constructed simulation that another human being had designed to keep her docile and blind. She forced herself to walk back to the computer. There was one final PDF attachment in the folder. It was a scanned receipt from a high-end, appointment-only jeweler on Newberry Street. It detailed the purchase of 2 white gold wedding bands. The description noted the identical custom wave engraving. The receipt showed 2 completely different dates of purchase, separated by 3 years, and 2 different sets of inner initials. The terrifying truth snapped into absolute focus. Callahan hadn't just stumbled into a double life out of weakness or circumstance. He had engineered it. He had drafted the blueprints for his betrayal, budgeted for it, and commissioned it piece by piece, exactly like one of his buildings. Just as Thalia was reaching for the mouse to close the window, a small banner notification popped up in the top right corner of the screen. It was an incoming email to a hidden Proton Mail account she had never seen before. The subject line was blank. The preview text read, Serafina is asking questions about last night. Do not fly to Charleston this weekend. Stay away until I fix this. Thalia read the message 3 times. She didn't touch the keyboard to open it. She didn't click through the rest of his emails. She simply pressed the keys to take a silent screenshot of the desktop. She dragged the image into a newly created USB drive, ejected it, and shut down the computer, making sure the screen went black and cold, exactly as she had found it. She was closing a door that was never, ever meant to creak. Late that afternoon, Callahan returned to the brownstone carrying a small paper bag from the corner pharmacy and wearing a soft, sympathetic smile. He said he had picked up some high-grade ibuprofen and bath salts for her, just in case her muscles were still aching from the chaotic shift. Thalia thanked him, her voice perfectly modulated, but as she watched him, the veil was completely gone. She observed his micro-movements, The way he placed his keys face down on the entryway console to hide the tags. The way he set his smartphone on the dining table with the screen pressed against the wood. The way his eyes consciously avoided lingering on the closed door of his home office. Before today, these tiny gestures would have been completely invisible to her. Now, they were screaming sirens. The following morning, Thalia called the charge nurse at Mass General and requested 2 days of emergency personal leave. She offered no dramatic details, simply stating she had an urgent family matter that required her immediate attention. Then, she dialed Maura. Maura was an administrative director at the hospital and Thalia's closest confidant. Maura was a fiercely practical woman, the kind of New Englander who didn't offer hollow platitudes or ask invasive questions when she heard the distinct, hollow tone of devastation in a friend's voice. "I need to go to Charleston," Thalia said into the receiver. "And I need you to come with me. I'll book the flights. What time do you want to be at Logan?" Was Maura's only reply. They took a direct flight from Boston to Charleston early the next morning. Thalia carried a thick, navy blue leather folder in her carry-on tote. Inside were the printed copies of the color-coded calendar, the bank transfer receipts, the lease agreement, the Newberry Street jewelry invoice, and the screenshot of the cryptic email. During the 3-hour flight, Thalia barely spoke a word. She stared out the scratched oval window, watching the jagged coastline of the eastern seaboard blur into a wash of blues and grays, the light shifting coldly across the glass. Maura sat in the aisle seat, reading a book, occasionally placing a fresh bottle of water on Thalia's tray table, never once demanding an explanation. When they landed at Charleston International, they rented a nondescript silver sedan. Thalia plugged the Sullivan's Island address into the GPS. They drove over the grand, sweeping bridge, leaving the historic downtown behind, and entering the quiet, wealthy coastal enclave where the air smelled heavily of salt marsh and blooming jasmine. The streets were lined with sprawling oak trees draped in Spanish moss. They found the house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was a beautiful, 2-story white weatherboard home with deep green shutters, a wide wraparound porch, and a small pink bicycle with training wheels leaning haphazardly against the front steps. Thalia killed the engine and sat in the oppressive silence of the car. "Don't get out yet," Maura whispered, finally breaking her silence, her eyes locked on the front door. She didn't need to. Exactly 40 minutes later, the heavy oak door swung open. Serafina emerged first. Her right arm was securely wrapped in a dark blue fiberglass cast and a sling. She moved carefully, wincing slightly as she descended the porch steps. A moment later, a little boy who looked to be about 5 years old burst out of the house. He had a mop of dark, wavy hair, Callahan's hair, and was wearing a Boston Red Sox cap, dribbling a soccer ball across the driveway. Trailing right behind him was a tiny girl with messy brown pigtails, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit to her chest. Serafina knelt down awkwardly, struggling with her one good hand to zip up the little girl's light windbreaker. She pressed a gentle kiss to the boy's forehead, laughing at something he said, before herding them toward a silver SUV parked in the driveway. Watching them, Thalia felt the white-hot, blinding rage inside her suddenly shift. It didn't evaporate, it crystallized. It became something icy, sharp, and terrifyingly precise. There was no extravagant luxury here. There was no sultry, malicious mistress lounging in silk. There was only an exhausted, injured mother desperately trying to get her kids to elementary school on a Thursday morning. "That's Lyra," Thalia murmured, the words slipping out of her mouth almost involuntarily. Maura looked over at her, her face filled with quiet sorrow. But she didn't say a word. Across the street, the little girl looked up at Serafina and yelled something joyous that the wind carried away. Serafina beamed back at her, a smile of pure, unadulterated maternal love, the exact same fierce love that any mother would show, even when her body was bruised and aching. In that single crystalline moment, Thalia understood a truth that stripped away the last agonizing shred of her doubt. Serafina Adler wasn't acting like a woman who had successfully stolen another woman's husband. She was acting exactly like someone who was entirely trapped inside the very same lie. Thalia and Maura flew back to Boston that same evening. On the plane, Thalia unzipped the navy blue folder on her tray table. She methodically arranged the papers in chronological order. First, the receipt for the rings, then the color-coded logistics spreadsheet, then the monthly $1,500 transfers. And finally, the screenshot of the warning email, "Stay away until I fix this." The morning after she returned, Thalia made a phone call to Gwendolyn Pierce. a high-profile family law attorney based in the financial district, highly recommended by the chief of surgery at MGH. Gwendolyn was sharp, impeccably dressed, and entirely devoid of theatrical sympathy. She listened to Thalia lay out the narrative in a sterile, factual monotone. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she asked for copies of the bank accounts, the tax returns, the firm's incorporation documents, and, most importantly, absolute, ironclad silence. "Do not confront him," Gwendolyn ordered, tapping a silver pen against her mahogany desk. "Do not let him know you know. We need a strategy. We need to trap his assets before he realizes the walls are closing in." That night, back in the Beacon Hill brownstone, Callahan poured 2 glasses of expensive Cabernet. He casually mentioned that he would, unfortunately, have to take the red-eye to Charleston on Friday to smooth over the permitting issues with the hotel investors. Thalia accepted the wine glass, letting her fingers brush against his. "Of course," she said, offering a serene, supportive smile. "You have to protect your project. I know how important it is to you." Callahan exhaled a long breath, visibly relieved that he had bypassed her suspicion. He kissed her cheek and went to bed early. At exactly 11:16 p.m., when the rhythmic sound of Callahan's breathing confirmed he was in a deep sleep, Thalia slipped out of bed. She padded silently into the living room, shut the heavy pocket doors, and pulled out her phone. She dialed the number she had memorized from the MGH intake form. The phone rang 4 times. Thalia was about to hang up when a cautious, hushed voice answered. "Hello?" Thalia took a deep, stabilizing breath. "Serafina. My name is Thalia Thorne. I am the trauma nurse who treated you 3 nights ago at Mass General. I need to speak with you about Callahan Vance." On the other end of the line, the silence was so absolute, so heavy, that for a long moment Thalia thought Serafina had dropped the phone. Then, she heard the shaky intake of breath, the rustle of fabric, the distinct click of a bedroom door being quietly pushed shut. "What do you have to say to me about Callahan?" Serafina's voice was trembling, defensive, lined with fear. Thalia didn't launch into a hysterical accusation. She didn't scream. Her years of delivering the most devastating medical news to shattered families had taught her that the truth, if hurled like a weapon, will only destroy the person who desperately needs to hear it. She spoke slowly, her voice soft and measured. She recounted the night in the emergency room. She mentioned the smartphone, the contact saved as husband, the lock screen photo with the ocean, the white gold ring with the custom wave engraving. Then, Thalia recited the exact address of the White House on Sullivan's Island. Serafina didn't interrupt her once. She listened in paralyzed silence until the address was spoken. "How do you know where my children live?" Serafina whispered, her voice cracking. "Because Callahan pays the lease on that house from a joint checking account that is legally registered to both him and me," Thalia answered gently. "And because I have the bank records sitting in front of me right now." The phrase bank records seemed to shift the entire atmospheric pressure of the phone call. The defensive wall in Serafina's voice began to crumble. She started asking tiny, hyper-specific questions, testing the waters to ensure she wasn't losing her mind before she took another step into the nightmare. She asked for Callahan's middle name. She asked for the exact name of his Boston architectural firm. She asked about the brand of the vintage watch he always wore. She asked about the thin, pale scar on his right knuckles. Thalia answered every single question flawlessly. Not to forcefully break the woman on the other end of the line, but to hold her hand through the impossible, suffocating doubt. Then, Serafina said something that made Thalia sit up rigidly on her velvet sofa. He told me you were his ex-wife," Serafina said, sobbing quietly now. "He told me that you were legally separated, but that you were having a massive psychological breakdown after the IVF treatments failed. He said you refused to sign the divorce papers out of spite. He begged me never to answer the phone if a Boston number called, because you were unstable and you would try to hurt me." Thalia closed her eyes. The darkness in the room felt physically heavy. Callahan hadn't just constructed a second life. He had actively weaponized Thalia's deepest, most agonizing trauma, her inability to carry a child, and used it as a psychological shield to protect his lies. He had turned her heartbreak into his alibi. The next morning, Serafina booked a direct flight from Charleston to Boston. She insisted Thalia not pick her up at Logan Airport. The paranoia Callahan had instilled in her was still a fresh wound. They agreed to meet at a small, dimly lit, independent coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street in Cambridge at 10:15 a.m. Serafina walked in wearing a heavy coat, her arms still secured in the sling, carrying a thick brown manila envelope. Her face was pale, shadowed by severe exhaustion, but her jaw was set with the grim determination of a woman who had decided she was done collapsing. They didn't hug when they met. It would have felt entirely unnatural, almost grotesque. They slid into a corner booth, ordered 2 black coffees, and placed their smartphones face down on the wooden table. Thalia unzipped her navy blue folder. Serafina opened her brown envelope. What followed over the next 3 hours contained absolutely no shouting. There were no tears of rage. It was significantly worse than that. It was the clinical, agonizing autopsy of 2 parallel lives. On February 14th of last year, Callahan had taken Thalia to an exclusive, candlelit dinner in Beacon Hill, gifting her a rare first-edition book of poetry. That exact same night, he had texted Serafina to say he was trapped in a grueling, mandatory late-night emergency session with his corporate investors. On May 3rd, Serafina slid a photograph across the table. It was Callahan, wearing a party hat, helping Dorian blow out the candles on a superhero birthday cake. On that very same day, Thalia had a saved text message from him complaining that his flight from a site visit had been delayed by a massive storm, and he was stuck sleeping in an airport lounge. In July, during the absolute lowest point of Thalia's life, when she had walked out of the Boston fertility clinic weeping uncontrollably in the parking garage, Callahan had held her in his arms for 20 solid minutes, kissing her hair and telling her they were enough for each other. That exact same evening, he had written an email to Serafina. Serafina slid the printed email across the table. Thalia read it. It's almost over. The lawyers say she's finally breaking down. Soon, my love. Soon we will be a real family with no more shadows. Serafina gripped her coffee mug with her one good hand, her knuckles white. I believed him, she whispered, not looking for absolution, but simply stating a tragic fact. I truly believed he was just fighting to get back to his children. Thalia didn't reply immediately. She looked at Serafina's cast, at the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, at the way her shoulders curved inward defensively. Thalia realized with absolute clarity that the suffocating shame of this betrayal didn't belong to either of the women sitting at this table. It belonged entirely to the ghost who had engineered it. They used Thalia's phone to call Gwendolyn Pierce from the cafe. The lawyer reiterated her strict instructions. Neither of them was to confront Callahan yet. They needed financial records. They needed timestamps. They needed proof of his fabricated expenses, his fraudulent travel logs, and his false promises. Gwendolyn also immediately referred Serafina to a ruthless family law attorney in South Carolina to initiate immediate proceedings for paternity establishment, sole legal custody, and child support. Before they stood up to leave, Serafina reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded photograph. She handed it to Thalia. It was Callahan standing on a white sand beach in the Carolinas. Dorian was riding on his shoulders, laughing joyously, and little Lyra was clinging tightly to his leg. On the back of the photo, written in Callahan's elegant, architectural handwriting, was a single sentence. For when we can finally stop hiding. Thalia didn't say a word. She took the photograph and carefully slid it into a clear plastic sleeve inside her folder alongside the bank records and the fake IVF emails. That afternoon, when Thalia returned to the Beacon Hill brownstone, the silence of the apartment felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. She methodically packed a single rolling suitcase. She packed her passport, her personal banking ledgers, her medical files, the vintage jewelry she had inherited from her grandmother, and a small potted lavender plant she had painstakingly kept alive on the balcony. Then, she walked into the bedroom. She printed out the color-coded Coastal Projects calendar in full size. She laid it perfectly flat in the exact center of his side of the king-sized mattress. On top of the calendar, she placed her white gold wedding band right over the cell marking Lyra's pediatrician appointment. Beneath the ring, she left a piece of high-grade cardstock. On it, she had written one single, flawless line. I know exactly how you divided my life. Callahan found the note at 9:01 p.m. Thalia knew the exact minute because her phone, resting on the kitchen island of Mora's Cambridge apartment, suddenly began to vibrate violently. First came 3 back-to-back phone calls, then a barrage of frantic text messages. Thalia, where are you? Thalia, please, this is a misunderstanding. Thalia, you need to talk to me. Then came the long, breathless voicemails that she refused to open. By the 10th missed call, she powered the phone down completely. She didn't do it out of fear. She did it out of military-grade strategy. Gwendolyn had been crystal clear during their afternoon briefing. Absolutely no private arguments. No emotional showdowns without witnesses. No allowing a master manipulator like Callahan the opportunity to twist his sociopathic guilt into a tearful, sentimental plea for forgiveness. The evidence was secured. The trap was set. All that was left was to let the man show his true face when the walls of his labyrinth finally collapsed. The next morning, Thalia powered her phone back on. There were 34 missed calls. The final text message from Callahan, sent at 3:15 a.m., read, "You are overreacting drastically. You're having an episode. We can fix this quietly. Do not involve lawyers." Thalia took a screenshot of the text and forwarded it directly to Gwendolyn. At 11 a.m., Callahan walked through the sliding glass doors of Mass General Hospital. Thalia had just finished redressing a severe burn wound and was scrubbing her hands at the deep stainless steel sink when a junior nurse pushed open the swinging doors of the ward. "Thalia, there's a guy at the security desk demanding to see you. He says he's your husband. He looks incredibly agitated." Thalia dried her hands meticulously with a paper towel. She took a deep breath, letting her heart rate settle into the rhythmic, cold pace of a trauma nurse. She walked out into the main waiting vestibule. She did not go alone. Maura was flanking her right side, and the hospital's imposing shift supervisor, a no-nonsense man named David, stood close behind her. Callahan was standing near the vending machines. His expensive camel hair overcoat was unbuttoned. His tie was loosened, and the dark, heavy bags under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept a single minute. He clutched a black leather portfolio tightly to his chest. When he saw her, his face contorted. He tried to force the old, charming, soothing smile onto his lips, but the gesture completely shattered before it even reached his eyes. "Thalia, honey, please. Just give me 5 minutes in the courtyard." "Please," he begged, stepping forward. "My attorney, Gwendolyn Pierce, will be the one speaking with you from now on," Thalia replied, her voice echoing coldly in the cavernous lobby. Callahan's eyes darted nervously toward Maura and David. He took another step forward, dropping his voice to a desperate, vicious whisper. "You have no idea what you're doing right now. If you drag this out into the light, you aren't just ruining me. You are going to completely destroy those 2 innocent children in Charleston." Thalia felt the psychological blow land, exactly where he had aimed it straight at her maternal grief. But she did not flinch. She did not step back. She looked him dead in the eyes. "I wasn't the one who buried them in the dark, Callahan." Callahan looked around frantically. There were too many people. Too many nurses in scrubs, too many security cameras, too much unfiltered reality crashing in on his carefully controlled world. He took one final step toward her, his face hardening into something ugly and venomous. "Serafina doesn't understand anything," he hissed, the mask entirely gone. "She's confused and unstable. And so are you. You're sick, Thalia. You're letting your grief make you crazy." Beside Thalia, Maura casually adjusted the smartphone she had been holding at her hip. The screen was illuminated. The entire threat had just been recorded in crystal-clear high definition. That very same afternoon, down in South Carolina, Serafina answered a knock at her front door. A delivery driver handed her a massive, lavish arrangement of 24 long-stemmed red roses. Tucked into the ribbon was a heavy, embossed card. Serafina opened it. "Don't let her psychotic delusions destroy our beautiful family. I'm coming home soon." Serafina didn't throw the flowers in the trash. She set them on the kitchen counter, took a high-resolution photograph of the arrangement and the card, slid the card into a protective plastic sleeve, and immediately called her attorney in Charleston. 2 days later, the dual legal strikes were launched simultaneously. Thalia's aggressive petition for absolute divorce on the grounds of cruel and abusive treatment was filed in the Massachusetts Family Court. At the exact same time, Serafina's petition for paternity establishment, sole physical and legal custody, and retroactive child support was filed in the Charleston County Courthouse. But Gwendolyn Pierce wasn't finished. She drafted a formal legal inquiry and had it delivered by courier to the sleek, glass-walled offices of Callahan's architecture firm in Boston's financial district. The letter was addressed directly to Callahan's senior business partner, Alaric Shaw. It formally requested the preservation of all financial ledgers, corporate expense accounts, and travel logs pertaining to the Coastal Project's SC account. citing an ongoing marital asset investigation. Alaric Shaw called Thalia's cell phone at 8 p.m. that evening. His voice sounded utterly different from the jovial, backslapping architect Thalia had shared drinks with at dozens of lavish firm holiday parties. He sounded hollowed out. "Thalia," Alaric began, his voice tight. "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer me very carefully. Did you, as his legal spouse, authorize any personal funds to be routinely charged back to the firm under the guise of site supervision and material procurement?" Thalia closed her eyes. The puzzle was finally locking into its final shape. "No, Alaric. I did not." The silence on the other end of the line lasted barely 3 seconds, but it was long enough for Thalia to know that Alaric had just found the rotting floorboards in his own company. The firm's emergency internal audit began on Monday morning. Callahan hired a crisis management lawyer and desperately tried to frame the discrepancies as minor administrative oversights, sloppy bookkeeping due to stress. But forensic accounting does not bow to charm, and numbers do not lie. The auditors uncovered dozens of fraudulent receipts. Luxury hotel suites in Charleston booked on dates when no site meetings occurred. Duplicate mileage reports, expensive per diem dining charges logged when he was actually sleeping in the Sullivan's Island house. And, most damning of all, the monthly $1,500 transfers meticulously disguised as independent contractor fees. In total, over $110,000 of the firm's operational capital had been covertly siphoned, redirected, or fraudulently justified over the course of nearly 3 years to fund his second life. Alaric did not scream when he cornered Callahan in the firm's executive boardroom. He simply locked the heavy glass door, dropped the thick binder of forensic audits onto the mahogany table, and handed Callahan a pen. He gave him 2 options: quietly surrender his equity in the partnership for pennies on the dollar and resign immediately, or face a highly publicized corporate embezzlement lawsuit that would completely incinerate the firm's reputation and likely end in felony fraud charges. Callahan signed the divestment papers 3 days later. The scandal didn't make the front page of the Boston Globe, but in the hyper-insular, gossipy world of elite New England real estate and architecture, a man doesn't need headlines to be ruined. 2 massive residential developers in Brookline immediately canceled their multi-million-dollar contracts with him. A highly lucrative commercial redesign in the Seaport District was frozen overnight. Callahan's name, which had spent a decade being synonymous with visionary elegance and unshakable trust, was now whispered at gala dinners with the same hushed disgust one reserves for black mold found in a luxury penthouse. Through it all, Thalia sat in sterile conference rooms. She gave sworn depositions, signed endless stacks of notarized documents, organized her financial independence, and never once missed a shift at Mass General. She didn't feel a triumphant, cinematic victory. She mostly felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. But it was a clean exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that comes after cutting away necrotic tissue to save a limb. Late one Tuesday evening, Gwendolyn called her while Thalia was sitting in the hospital cafeteria. Callahan's lawyers just reached out. He wants to negotiate an immediate settlement. He's terrified of this going to a public trial, Gwendolyn said, her tone dripping with professional satisfaction. Thalia looked out the massive plate glass window. Outside, the city of Boston was moving through the rain, bright taillights streaking through the dark, entirely indifferent to her world ending and beginning again. Tell him the negotiation starts with him signing a sworn affidavit explicitly detailing the timeline of the infidelity and the financial fraud, Thalia said flatly. Gwendolyn paused. There's one more thing. Serafina's lawyer called me an hour ago. The preliminary court-ordered DNA results came back in South Carolina. Callahan is listed, with 99.9% certainty, as the biological father of both Dorian and Lyra. Thalia pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The phantom of the lie had finally been dragged into the harsh, uncompromising light of a legal document. He had nowhere left to hide. The divorce was finalized 9 brutal months later, in a dreary courtroom in downtown Boston. It was a freezing, sleet-filled morning in late November. Thalia signed the final decree with a steady hand. She didn't offer a bittersweet smile. She didn't break down in cathartic tears. She simply slid her copy of the judgment into a gray manila folder, thanked Gwendolyn, and walked out onto the icy pavement with the strange, weightless sensation of a survivor who has finally walked away from a burning building, knowing better than to look back at the ashes. Backed entirely into a corner by the avalanche of irrefutable evidence, Callahan had no choice but to legally concede to the double life, the covert diversion of marital assets, and the staggering financial penalties that accompanied the settlement. He didn't sign the papers out of a sudden, miraculous surge of moral repentance. He signed them because the meticulous paper trail Thalia and Serafina had built left him absolutely no oxygen to breathe. Down in South Carolina, Serafina secured full legal recognition of paternity for Dorian and Lyra, a court-mandated, aggressively garnished child support arrangement, and a heavily restricted, legally supervised visitation schedule for Callahan. The justice system couldn't erase the catastrophic psychological damage he had inflicted, but it forcibly dragged his chaos into a rigid, inescapable order. 6 months after the ink dried on the divorce decree, Thalia finally moved back into the Beacon Hill brownstone. She hadn't wanted to sell it immediately. Doing so felt like letting him chase her out of her own sanctuary. But before she could sleep there, she needed to violently exorcise his ghost from the architecture. She hired contractors to tear out his pristine home office, converting it into a sunlit reading room. She changed every lock, stripped and repainted the walls a warm, soft ivory, donated the massive mahogany dining table to a local charity, and bought entirely new furniture. She kept the balcony relatively bare, save for the single pot of lavender she had brought with her to Mora's. It had somehow survived the freezing winter, blooming stubbornly even when she had forgotten to water it during the darkest weeks of the legal battle. At first, the profound silence of the empty house felt suffocating. She would flinch at the sound of the radiator hissing, expecting the heavy thud of his suitcase in the hallway. She struggled with the phantom anxiety of a ringing cell phone. But slowly, agonizingly, the space began to heal her. She reclaimed the tiny, mundane victories of a sovereign life. She learned to drink her morning coffee by the window without compulsively checking her phone. She walked home from her shifts at the hospital without scanning the street for his car. She started buying her bread from the corner bakery again, finally shedding the paranoid feeling that everyone behind the counter knew the humiliating details of her life. One humid afternoon in July, Thalia's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from an unsaved number, though she knew exactly who it was. Serafina didn't include a long, emotionally taxing paragraph about Callahan. She simply sent a single photograph. It was a picture of Dorian running across a vibrant green soccer field in Charleston, his face flushed with joy, and little Lyra, sitting in the grass nearby, intensely focused on coloring a picture of a house with a wildly crooked purple roof. Thalia stared at the bright, living proof of the children she had once been manipulated into resenting. She typed back a single sentence. May they never, ever have to learn how to build a house out of lies. As the Boston autumn rolled in, painting the city in strokes of burnt orange and gold, Thalia found herself accepting an invitation for a casual cup of coffee from Declan Mercer, the new lead doctor in the hospital's physical rehabilitation wing. There were no grandiose romantic overtures. There were no sweeping promises of destiny. It was just an hour of genuinely pleasant conversation at a crowded cafe near the harbor, a shared laugh over the bureaucratic nightmares of hospital administration, his polite offer of his umbrella when it started to drizzle on their walkout, and a simple text message the very next day, arriving at the exact hour he had promised he would send it. On a crisp, windswept morning in late April, Thalia pushed open the French doors to her balcony. The city smelled richly of rain on hot pavement and blossoming cherry trees. The lavender plant was thick with vibrant new violet buds. Thalia rested both her hands on the cold wrought iron railing, closed her eyes, and pulled the clean air deep into her lungs. She wasn't entirely healed. Some fractures leave a permanent ache when the weather turns cold, but for the first time in an eternity, there was absolutely nothing in her life that required hiding in the dark. The cruelest part of betrayal isn't just the physical act of what the person did. The true horror lies in the grueling, agonizing aftermath, when you are forced to painstakingly excavate and examine every single piece of your shared history. You have to interrogate the beautiful memories, the whispered promises in the dark, the framed photographs on the mantel, and the seemingly safe words that you once thought were a fortress, realizing they were actually the bars of a cage. Thalia had been forced to swallow a jagged, merciless truth. No matter how fiercely, how purely you love someone, your love cannot miraculously transubstantiate their lies into truth, nor can it absorb their cowardice and turn it into your own guilt. But in the ashes of that realization, Thalia discovered something infinitely more powerful. True dignity rarely announces itself with screaming matches or shattered glass. Sometimes, dignity is the terrifying, silent discipline of choosing not to lose your mind. It is the act of meticulously gathering your evidence, rallying your allies, asking for the help you deserve, and refusing, point blank, to let another person's monstrous cruelty mutate you into a version of yourself that you despise. Justice does not always arrive riding a white horse in a flawlessly cinematic climax. More often than not, it arrives in the quiet, absolute finality of notarized signatures. It arrives in the heavy, satisfying click of a newly installed deadbolt. It arrives in the peace of an unshared bank account. And it arrives in the profound, quiet victory of a woman who can finally lay her head on her pillow and fall asleep, knowing she will never again have to wake up in the middle of the night to check a stranger's phone. In the immediate wreckage of a shattered life, it is entirely natural to become paralyzed by the question, why? Why did he do this to me? Why wasn't I enough? But if you survive the fire, there comes a morning when the question fundamentally shifts. The why loses its power. The only question that matters anymore is, what am I going to do with myself now? And that is the exact moment the real architecture of a life begins. The moment we stop begging for an apology from the ghost who broke us, and simply choose to build a world where we can look ourselves in the mirror, entirely unbroken and entirely at peace.